I'm Mathieu Damati, a half Chinese and half Italian high school student, and I'm very honored and excited today to be able of interviewing and to be interviewed by Shannon and Callie from UNICEF. Before we start, I would like to thank you two for making this interview possible, and I hope and believe that this would share some interesting ideas and new perspectives about our future to the ones watching. In the following, myself and them will be asking each other some questions in relation to child rights and the SDGs, following their Impactor magazine titled Creating a New Social Contract for a Healthy, Just, and Sustainable World, which I found to be incredibly inspiring and very crucial questions and reflections of how we should rebuild a greener, more equal, more just, and more safe future following the COVID-19 pandemic. I believe it is an article that everyone in our time being should read. It was an honor to be one of the young people who is quoted in your article, and even better that I could now ask you some questions in relation to it. Let's start this interview. Shannon and Callie, can you please introduce yourselves?
Sure, I'm Shannon O'Shea. I'm the team leader for the Public Partner Advocacy, Visibility, and Sustainable Development Goals team, and very happy to be on the call with you today.
Hi, I'm Callie King-Guffey, and I'm a Public Partnerships Officer. I've been working with Shannon since 2013 on the SDGs, and I'm very passionate, like Shannon is, about child and youth participation. So excited to talk about our article on that topic with you.
It is really great to meet you both. So first I wanted to ask, what do children and youth uniquely have to offer in developing global solutions? And what could us young people do to improve personally for becoming more impactful?
Thanks. So I'll start with that one. It's a really, really good question. And I have 3 points on this. One is that I'm a firm believer that people are the experts of their own experience. And what do I mean by this? I mean that if you're going to design a program or a policy to improve the lives of people living in poverty, you need to talk to people that are currently living in poverty. Or if you're going to design something for people living with disabilities, you need to consult with people that have disabilities. And I think that Callie and I both felt, especially when the Sustainable Development Goals were first being negotiated, that children were actually not being given that same opportunity. Children are only being seen as beneficiaries rather than what you are, which is experts in your own lived experience, and also agents of change. So it was really important for us to work with key partners in civil society and government to change the narrative from seeing children and young people only as beneficiaries, but actually what you are, which is experts and agents of change. Secondly, UNICEF has known for a long, long time in our work in 190 plus countries around the world for the last almost 75 years, that when you educate children about issues that affect their lives or affect their communities, it actually has a halo benefit of affecting and teaching the entire community. So for example, we learned that when children learned about washing their hands and practicing good sanitation and hygiene in school, they actually brought that learning back to their household, and they helped to influence their family members and their brothers and sisters. So we know that when you help to educate children, particularly young children, about these issues, it actually has a benefit for the entire community. And then my last point on this is we've learned in some amazing ways how children are inventing things. You are activists, you are artists, you are influencers. And I know that Callie and I have been really, really floored and just incredibly impressed by some of the things that young people are telling us that they've invented. Things that can help actually clean up the ocean, or new ways of capturing energy, or the amazing activism that we've seen for young people, boys and girls, to get plastics banned in their countries and saving millions of pounds of waste dumping into our oceans or into landfills. So we know that when young people are engaged and they learn about these issues, they're actually going to be the ones that drive change in the community. So that's why it's so important to be able to engage young people.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think Shannon touched on the most important elements. I think children and young people have so many characteristics that make them unique, solution-oriented people in these global development issues. I think when you're talking about solutions to problems that require imagination, children's imagination will be crucial to making sure that we go beyond the status quo, and that we fix, you know, systems that are clearly broken, that the SDGs intend to fix. I think also there was a really interesting article or interview a few years ago with a young Indigenous man, Shutez Kat, who is an environmental activist and musician. And he talked about the power of child innocence, and how innocence sounds like something that's quite naive, but really it's quite powerful. You look at the growing disillusionment with political systems and decision-making processes, and meanwhile children and young people are advocating very authentically for a better world, for a cleaner environment, for a more just society. And I have seen, I think Shannon and I have both seen at the UN, this really takes shape in powerful ways when young people are speaking to decision makers at the UN, how those leaders listen with their eyes and their ears open a little bit more. Because there's no alternative motive that children and young people have other than really just frankly and ethically speaking up for what they believe in. And then I think, just to reiterate what Shannon said about social norm change, young people, when they learn about issues, are changing social norms. And we're seeing that even in the conversations about combating racism today, how critical young people are to making sure that that their households, their schools, their communities are changing the social norms that are racist. So I think, oh, Shannon, did you want to ask Mattia?
Yeah, so Mattia, I actually have a question for you now, which is, why do you think it's important for leaders and decision makers at the UN, but also beyond, to hear from children and young people like yourself?
Okay, I believe it is crucial for leaders at the UN to hear from young people, because we are the ones that will actually be living in the future that the UN is trying to prevent and create, which means that we should be able to have a say and to be listened on how we would and how we would not want this future to be like. In addition, large population of children are unfortunately the victims of armed conflict, domestic violence, natural diseases, and other problems. Therefore, it would be essential to understand their perspective on the issue, so that UN can understand the whole picture and ways to fully resolve it. Not listening from the child's voice would be absurd, because how can the UN solve social problems correctly without understanding the victim's perspective? I would now like to ask that, as the world urges to build back better, as you mentioned in your article, how could we convince the public and political that the inclusion of child and youth voice is one of the right ways to do this?
I think what you just articulated, Mattia, is so spot on. It's absurd to make decisions about the future without the future generation involved. And that's what we quoted you on, right? In the article, you really articulated the right of the future generation to be included in decisions about the future. And the SDGs are about the future, so it's really important for this to take shape. I think in terms of convincing the public and the public sector to include children and young people, I think that there is a recognition that children and young people have things to say about these issues and these problems that our world faces. And that's something that our article touched on. You know, there's recognition, but we need to go further. I think there needs to be a reckoning that what young people are saying then needs to really inform decision making and policy making, and the actions that that leaders and governments take. And I think one of the things that stuck out the past 2 weeks at the high-level political forum for me, where I was really excited to see this growing centrality to the importance of not only disaggregating data, but collecting data from diverse sources, including citizen-generated data and youth-generated data. And this is something that we were strong advocates for, starting years ago. So 6 years ago, I think this conversation was taking shape, but really led by civil society organizations. And the past 2 weeks, we saw member states and governments making statements again and again about, again, the importance and the centrality of collecting data from people to complement official statistics with a fuller picture of what the realities children and young people are facing. So I think if we continue to offer concrete ways in which children and youth voice can be integrated in decision making, so through on and offline datas and surveys, consultations, if we continue to mainstream those mechanisms, I think it's one of the best ways that we can really convince the public sector and decision makers of the value that this information provides for their decision making.
Yeah, just to quickly compliment what Callie said, because she covered a lot of things that I would have fully agreed with. But sometimes I'm worried that decision makers aren't necessarily thinking that children have been affected by COVID because they're not the most vulnerable group in terms of the health implications. So fortunately, children and young people are not getting as sick from COVID as other age groups. But of course, your lives have been completely upended. UNICEF data shows that 92% of the world's children and youth were affected by school closures. That's over 1.8 billion children worldwide whose education has been disrupted. And a number of those children, especially the most vulnerable, are going to face lifelong consequences of that. They might never go back to school because it was already very difficult for them to be able to get an education to start with. So we have to ensure that this crisis does not snowball into what becomes a lost generation of young people. It was something that, again, someone had said at the high-level political forum last week, and it really resonated with me. We cannot let this crisis cause a lost generation. And I think that, as we know, this crisis has caused untold human suffering and devastated economies and shut down health systems. But if we're going to be able to see something positive from this, it's forced all of us to pause and reflect on the fact that many of our systems and our processes are not fit for purpose and that they are not sustainable for the long term. So let us take the opportunity of having to go through this pause to really do what we need to do to make those systems work for the future and also work for the environment and the planet. We're not the only species that calls the Earth home, and we need to ensure that what we're doing doesn't just affect other future generations, but also doesn't affect the rest of the species that we share the planet with.
So, Mattia, building on what you had earlier said, what do you think the UN should do to continue to bring child and youth voices into our decision-making processes, including young people that might not typically have such opportunity?
I think the UN should develop and introduce more digital methods to bring and engage child and youth voices, because this is an efficient way to access and empower a larger quantity of child and youth voice due to the increase in social media's influence on us. It allows more of us to share our views and concerns, even during global pandemics such as COVID-19, where a lot of us are in quarantine, but we could still clearly express our view digitally. And an example for this would be the recent protests against the tragic killing of George Floyd, where I have seen large numbers of children and youth taking action digitally to fight against racism. The significant speed and influence of how this information got passed online to the hearts of young people has shown the significant potential in social media, where the UN could step in to use it for engaging more young people from sharing their voice for the SDGs and also to develop a global loyalty. Because it seems that a greater number of young people are more capable and willing to share their voice and to be impacted through digitally. However, children and youth who are unable to access this platform, like without internet, should not be ignored. The UN should further empower organizations that specializes on reporting child and youth voices so that they can share an equal opportunity of making their voice heard. In addition to that, I would like to say that a world before the pandemic is not what we need and want. It was not sustainable enough to prevent us from further pandemics. COVID-19 has led to a decrease in our greenhouse gas emission. But would this be a long-lasting impact? What would our children and young people, what could children and young people do to ensure that the global recovery from COVID-19 would be more sustainable than before?
So maybe I'll start with this one, Mattia, because actually it's something that worries me a bit. As we know, a good benefit of everything being paused was that we did see things like pollution reduced and some animals returning to habitats where they previously weren't able to. And on the surface we say, oh, isn't that great? But my fear is that the decision makers who are skeptical about climate change or don't want to change the current unsustainable practices will actually use that against us. And what I mean is they will say, okay, fine, we were able to reduce gases or reduce pollution, but look at the terrible cost it came at. Economies shut down, millions of jobs lost. And what we don't want to see is that this becomes an either or scenario. So it can't be either we have a clean environment and reduce climate change and pollution, or we have jobs. We can't see that as either or. And in fact, the trends before COVID were showing that more and more businesses were understanding that investing in business practices and industries that had both a social and an environmental benefit were actually just as, if not more profitable than some of the more traditional businesses that didn't do this. And even when we saw, obviously at the height of COVID, there was a lot of turmoil in some of the global markets, like the stock market. And what we saw during the height of kind of the crash was that ESG stocks, those are environmental, social, and governance stocks, so the more socially and environmentally responsible companies, they actually performed much better than the overall market. So I think that those of us that believe in environmental progress and social progress need to continue to show the evidence to the skeptics that by investing in things that are green and socially responsible, it's actually better for the economy in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to say that I think in terms of what children and young people can do to ensure that the response and recovery is more environmentally sustainable, I think, again, the social norm change that young people champion is really important. And I would like to see both individual scale change and system scale change. And I think what Shannon and I wrote in the Impactor article was giving credit to the children and young people that have really taken this conversation so far. And now it is time for decision makers, both across public and private sectors, to take action. And children and young people can't do this on themselves. We need action. We need what Shannon had mentioned, a renewal in investment in financial practices that really put this front and center as an issue.
Well, Well, those are very interesting perspectives that I never thought of and very important. And now I would like to ask, what could we do to encourage more for-profit businesses, as you mentioned before, from sacrificing some of their short-term private benefit for engaging in the SDGs? And what does this pandemic and the SDGs mean for our future entrepreneurs?
Yeah, I think that this also touches on one of the earlier question about this is I actually think that we're reaching a tipping point where some of these key investments have been made, where they are starting to pay off the dividends, where we're not seeing actually that there needs to be much of a sacrifice in terms of short-term benefits to seeing profitability. Maybe that could have been the case 5 or 7 years ago when some of the social impact investing in some of these companies were just starting to get off the ground. But I think that, again, some of the best performing companies are those that are investing in renewable energy, or those that are investing in the circular economy, or those that are looking at plant-based solutions for food systems. So I'm very excited about this, and I think it's just the beginning. I think that there's so many more companies that I'm seeing every day, and some of the most innovative people, young people, some of the smartest money that you see in the world is actually going exactly towards these types of businesses where they do have this benefit for societies and for environment. And you're also seeing a de-investing in those types of companies and those types of industries that are not practicing sustainability.
Yeah, and the new economy that Shannon, I think, just described has been really largely shaped by young people and young consumers. So when we were writing the article, I was really pleasantly surprised to see that 90% of Gen Z consumers expect companies to be socially and environmentally responsible. And further research showed that their metric for whether or not a company is really authentically engaging in social and environmentally responsible practices is if a company is willing to sacrifice short-term gains for aligning to the values that they say that they're aligned to. And what's interesting is that children and young people, so young consumers, are more willing to do that, to pay extra for products that are ethically sourced or serviced. And so the message here was, in a lot of ways, that companies should be like children. They should be sacrificing these short-term gains for the common good, for the future of the environment and society. So I think there's a lot that young consumers are doing to push this new economy. But like Shannon just painted, I mean, thankfully, because of that, the short-term losses that maybe previously were required are far less than they used to be. And I think now it's actually arguably profitable to follow suit of young consumers and advocates.
Well, it is really great to hear about this as the demand changed and how business can benefit from benefiting the SDGs. It's really great news. Now, my new question would be, what does the world's reaction to COVID-19 show about the flaws in the social contract between nations? And how can the UN, child and young people engage to show that we need to unite for global challenges in the future and prevent nationalist isolation? In other words, how can young people and the UN encourage more people and nations to have a stronger global identity and loyalty?
Well, one thing that I have been really struck by is research that's shown that young people from around the world identify more as a global citizen than they do as a citizen of their own national countries. So I do think that children and young people are doing a lot around fostering global citizenship around the world, and that is really key to combat nationalism and isolationism. With that said, there are very strong forces that are propelling nationalism and isolationism. So I think that there are ways in which young people can really consider how to intentionally build on the global citizenship that they've built in the young generations around the world. And I think that's one of the reasons why at UNICEF we're really passionate about global citizenship education and SDG education, about getting children and young people to critically think about how these global issues impact their individual lives, and how necessary of a starting point that is to really cultivate and support global citizenship among the young generation.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And just to say that, you know, the world that we live in right now, and I think it's going to only intensify for the future, is that we are all interconnected. You know, pollution doesn't respect borders. When you throw out plastic things in New York City, it washes up on a beach in Bali. And when a virus starts on one end of the world, if we're not careful, it can spread to every corner of the world. So whether people want to accept it or not, we are all connected and dependent on each other for having a healthy planet and even our own physical health. So I think that it very much behooves us to think of ourselves as global citizens, and that gone are the times when you can only be concerned about what is happening in your own little world or your own small community, because the world is very, very interconnected. And also information is shared at lightning speed from across, you know, around the world. So that is going to be the future, and we need to consider then how we work together as global citizens. And I think that there's something actually very, very beautiful about that. I mean, the United Nations was created 75 years ago with the understanding that that we're dependent on each other for our safety, our health, for not having another world war. And we need to embrace that. And I think that when we can work together towards positive change, we can do really, really extraordinary things. So to me, that's a much, much better way for your individual life to be better, by being a global citizen rather than being more isolationist.
How you suggested that we can overcome nationalism is incredible. But however, unfortunately, not everyone believes that they could make a positive difference, or even wants to, at least not yet. In this case, how has the United Nations created a system where it provides personal benefit for people to engage in the SDGs? Without empathy and passion be enough to achieve the SDGs by 2030? Or do we need a system which provides personal incentive for everyone to engage in it? For this question, I'm referring to all individuals, businesses, and nations.
You know, I think that things need to work at different levels for the SDGs to be achieved. I think that we need decision makers at the very highest level of governments and of business to be changing the way that they behave. But individual actions do matter. And I used to give this example when talking about the SDGs in my own life, and it really kind of struck me about what a butterfly effect it is. And it's a very small change, which is when I used to go to my gym, they would give out free water bottles. And almost everyone would take the free water bottle, and you'd probably have about 2 or 3 of them in a class. And at one point, they installed a water dispenser where you could actually fill up your own reusable bottle. So I started to, of course, bring my own bottle. And I noticed that within, I think it was only like 4 or 5 months, it had a little counter on the display, and it said that 20,000 bottles had not been thrown into a landfill because of people refilling. That's in one gym in one city where probably still about 90% of the customers were taking plastic. And already in a few months, 20,000 plastic bottles went in a landfill. So it doesn't require a huge change. Not everyone needs to be, you know, the biggest activist in the world. Not everyone needs to be a Nelson Mandela or a Greta. These are fabulous leaders and we need them, but make small changes in your own life. And when millions of people are doing it, it moves the needle. And we've seen it with COVID. When everyone stayed home or when everyone wears a mask, we flatten the curve. We've stopped the spread of a virus and we've saved lives. That's a very, very powerful lesson. So I would say to people who are maybe somewhat overwhelmed about engaging in the SDGs and saying, oh my God, these are huge goals. How could I as an individual ever contribute? And, you know, I don't want to save the world. That's not, you know, I just want to live my life and have a good time with my friends. No one's asking you to save the world, but if you can make some small changes and everyone else does the same, it actually can make an extraordinary difference.
Yes, and I think that the example of the water bottle dispenser is a great, or the water fountain is a great example because it really shows impact, which can help incentivize action. When you really can see the change that you're making, it really helps, I think, people not feel like their actions are just going into a void and not making a difference. But I think, Mattia, your question, you know, is empathy and passion enough is a really good question. That's a hard question to answer. I think that empathy will help explain to people what's in it for themselves. And what I mean by that is there is personal incentive embedded in the SDGs. You know, the SDGs help explain why a cleaner environment and a more just society and a more prosperous and equitable economy benefits not only the greater good, but individuals. And when you have more empathy for others and for the world, you ironically are kind of fulfilling your own, you know, incentives and needs. So I think, you know, building an empathy where we can greater understand how our needs are intrinsically connected is a really, really critical factor and a big missing piece in why we're not on track yet to achieve the SDGs, and why young people, I think, are making such a strong positive change because of their empathy and their global citizenship. So again, I think we need to listen more to children and young people and be more like them.
So Mattia, I have a question for you, because I know that in your schools and you know, in your school system, you've learned a lot about and been taking action on the SDGs. And in light of the COVID-19 crisis, how has your work on the SDGs changed? And what messages should decision makers hear from young people on this issue?
I believe that for the world, the COVID-19 crisis has been an unfortunate moment, but it has also been the best teacher. We have all suffered from it, but overall, this is a teacher which warns us how important it is to unite for fighting against the next global challenges before it is too late. However, the main thing to worry about would be how COVID-19 may lead to the opposite impact. Nations may now approach the more nationalism approach and adapt to more populistic ideas, leading to fewer cooperation between nations when other challenges arises. As Yuval Harari once wrote, nationalist isolation is probably even more dangerous in the context of climate change than of nuclear war. Therefore, I believe the UN should use this opportunity correctly to show how more cooperation between nations is what we need to put this crisis and the others coming along to an end. In addition, COVID-19 has fortunately improved our environment and decreased greenhouse gas emission. Therefore, it will be crucial to engage nations to make a plan that allows them to recover from the impact of the virus in a non-environmental damaging way, preventing us from facing another global challenge soon.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Callie.
I was just going to say I couldn't agree more that we we need to make sure that the suffering that COVID-19 has caused is not in vain, and that we ensure there are silver linings, that we do build back better and greener. So important parts.
And I think it just shows, you know, leaders, political leaders listen when their citizens are overwhelmingly telling them this is the way that we want the world to be, because they're politicians, and you know, at least in democratic societies, they are voted in and out of power. So I think that it behooves all of us to make our voices heard on issues that we care about, so that decision makers understand their accountabilities to what the people of the world really need and really want. And you know, to end on maybe a more positive note, I know that you know, there's a lot of fear about which way the world will go when we hopefully start to emerge from this crisis, and what does the new normal look like. And I think that we've seen displays, whether they're from leaders or from individuals, that many people around the world are dedicated to helping their neighbors, to working together to fight against this disease, to think about what this means for the world and what their values are as human beings for the future. So my hope is that what will emerge is an unequivocal demand for a world that is more fair, a world that cares about sustainability, a world that cares about the planet and the other species that live on the planet. And when we're all saying the same thing, decision makers, whether that's at the UN or an individual nations, do need to listen. So I think it's, again, just so incredibly important to hear from young people who are often right at the front and the face of these movements for a better world and for social change. So thank you.
This has been so inspirational and incredible for me, and I hope more people see this to get inspired. Thank you so much for your belief and hard work of building a better future with children and young people. I will definitely continue this journey as my passion, and I wish all the best to yours.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.